Well, I think we should just kick off. I was leaving it a wee bit just to see if folk had all found their way across the road here. So the first thing I want to say is, although they're not here, I'd like to just say thanks very much to all the folk at the shed, because they've been very, very good to the Glad Cafe and they've let us use the premises a few times now. So they're very nice folk. So I think in order to show our thanks, we should all turn up for the dancing on Friday. So I'll just see you outside on Friday. And this is the top room which was just reopened recently. So I hope you can look around, because they took away the false ceiling and they've exposed this very nice cornice. And then they've got, you know that guy, Adrian Murchie, he's done the mural. He's the guy that if you read the Glasgow Herald restaurant reviews, he draws all the restaurants. He hogs that job. So this is an Adrian Murchie mural, so it's pretty good, isn't it? So nice room, so thanks very, very much to the folk at the shed. So first time we've been out of the Glad Cafe, so that's a novelty. But to make up for that, it's the first time we've had a repeat speaker. So we have invited Gerry Hassan back, because Jerry's always got interesting things to say, and he's brought Jim MItchell from, I hope I'm right here, Jim used to be the Professor of Politics at Strathclyde, but has quite recently moved through to University of Edinburgh, where he's now Professor of Public Policy, whatever that is. We might find out more about it. So Gerry gave me the title of After Independence, which I thought was, After Independence, because that was a thought-provoking one. He said it was a sort of cheeky way of just saying after the vote next year. So I think, for me, the best thing about this whole process of the vote next year is it's just made people critique things more. You know, we're very good, not just in Scotland, but everywhere, I suppose, at just accepting things the way they are. But because we've got the chance of a choice to make, I think it's made people really think about, what would we like after next year? What sort of country would we like to live in? Which I suppose people don't spend much time thinking about that. What sort of country would we like to live in? And how could we move towards getting a bit closer to it? So I hope that's what we're going to hear a fair bit about this afternoon. But as usual, with the Glad Academy, we don't start just with a talk, we start with yourselves singing. So I thought for this one, we might revisit at least one of the songs that we've done in the past and do a couple of Scottish anthems. So we'll close with Hamish Henderson's Freedom Camoye, which is probably the greatest song written in Scotland in 500 years. And we'd start with probably the greatest songwriter of the last century in Scotland, Michael Mara's, his attempt to write a Scottish national anthem, Hermless. So if you don't know that one, then we are in for a great treat here. Of course, Mara came from Dundee. I do not come from Dundee myself. My compatriot Brycey, who's going to play guitar with us, he has spent a fair bit of time in Dundee, but his throat is knackered just now with the cold. So we've invited a son of Dundee, that home of the Beano, to lead us in the song, and it's Doug Small going to some of his Perkin Warbeck. So big Warbeck around the applause. So you got a song sheet there. So Warbeck is not going to solo here, he's going to lead you in song.
I'm sure a lot of people have seen Michael, and Swan is correct. He used to say that he didn't like all the other contenders for a Scottish national anthem because they were too militaristic, 13, 14 and all that. And as Swan said, this was his suggestion, and Hermas in other words, if you come round to my house, it will be all right. That was the gist of it. So I'm sure you all know the chorus. I join the verses as well, obviously. My hand on my heart, and my heart in my mouth, we ends that would reach o'er the sea. My feet might be big, but the insects are safe. They'll never get screwed on by me. Hairless, hairless, there's never any bother for me. Lovely. I get to the library, I tackle a book, and then I get in for my tea. I save all the coupons that come with the soup, and when I have saved 53, I'll send over 50, put 3 in the drawer, and something gets posted to me. Hairless, hairless, there's never any bother for me. I do what I'm told, and I tidy my room, and then I come down for my tea. There's 8 or 12 lads that I could cram my chums. They're canny and meek as can be. There's Tom with his pigeons, and Wally his mice, and Robert McLennan and me. Hairless, hairless, there's never any bother for me. I'm getting to the library, I tackle a book, and then I come in for my tea. Right, let's hear you this time. Hairless, lovely. Hairless, there's never any bother for me. Nobody noticed that I was there. If I didn't come in for my tea.
Lovely singing. Okay, so let's welcome Gerry Hassan and Jim Mitchell.
Thanks for that. It's great to be introduced with the tunes and the wonder of Michael Mara. I had the pleasure of knowing Michael, and it was a great experience because I got him and the great legendary Gil Scott-Heron in conversation, and exchanged notes between the two of them. Gil Scott-Heron was one of the inventors of rap before it went down the boy route, and they were strangely in a way rather similar by the point I got to them. They were incredibly self-effacing, quiet men who could probably do as geniuses with a wee bit of organisation to give them a bit more oomph, and they were so similar in their different ways. So it's a bit of like Scotland, the Universal, I found when I met Michael, and then put him in contact with Gil. Great experience in life. James and myself are going to both talk a wee bit, not too much, and then have hopefully a blether, and maybe even a bit of a cross-examination, hopefully more a conversation about some of this, about after independence. What we're going to talk about is the independence debate, and give you an exclusive preview of the forthcoming yet to be unravelled. In fact, as we were just talking, Scotland on Sunday were after both of us on Friday, weren't they? Because they didn't know what we're covering politically to get an exclusive preview of the book. James didn't return their call because of their mobile, and I just left the second call and didn't bother giving them it. Because you know, the media are chasing you sometimes for some, just to use you. And so you're the exclusive preview of After Independence, which is out next Saturday, God willing, and launched at SNP conference by myself and James. Now, just to disappoint some of you, we have not put together a pro-independence book or an anti-independence book, because we want to have a cake and eat it here a wee bit. We put together a book on the possibilities of independence. So it's kind of exploring some of the philosophy, some of the detail, and some of the choices that will lie ahead of us. And so I'm going to briefly make three arguments, 3 points. How we got here, where on earth we are, because that kind of matters, and where we're going. And then from that, Jim's going to more explore that latter point, which is one of the major parts of our book. So, how did we get here? We have to know how we got here to know where we are. We have to know where we've travelled from. There's an argument often put that we got here, you hear some people who are a bit unsure of where we are, that we got here by accident. But then there's another argument, we got here by design. This is kind of like, we've been building to this for centuries, decades. And of course, the truth is, both arguments are correct. There is an accident element into where we are, where we've come from, and that's the timing. The unexpected SNP landslide of 2011, which then led to, okay, there's negotiations about, how many questions, etc., but it broadly set the parameters of a vote in 2014. But there's a bigger story there, and a longer story about design and about the nature of Scottish society and the nature of Britain that have brought us to this point. And that is about the existence of the Scottish dimension. It's about the last 45 years of Scotland thinking overtly, disputing, discussing the constitutional questions, then the establishment of the Scottish Parliament after the 97 referendum. The fault line between Labour and SNP has been, rather unattractive at points, but the main fault line of Scottish politics. And in a way, no one completely owning all of this. Sometimes people say like Labour created the Scottish Parliament or Civic Scotland created the Scottish Parliament, but indeed, actually, a whole host of forces brought that about and have brought this about. And one of them, not the exclusive one, but one of them is the SNP's contributory contribution to Scottish public life and that constitutional question remaining one of the key issues. So it was always going to be that those issues around self-government, what form it took, independence, were going to find more expression. And they found expression from 2014, an independence referendum. And so something like this, maybe not necessarily yes, no question, but something like this is always going to happen sometime in the future. So it's accident and design. So where are we? First, we have this challenge of yes, no vote, what it means, the implication, and how it's played out pre-2014. And I think, again, I'm trying to say something kind of that I think is actually quite complex, but it's going to sound quite simple, is it showcases numerous qualities and great capacities in parts of Scottish people. It showcases Scottish society changing, the fact that there's been lots of energies unleashed, often at the margins of beyond institutional society, groups like National Collective, groups like the Commonweal Project and the Jimmy Lee Foundation. And this is all, in a way, I think, a little bit the unintended consequences of the long game from the 2011 vote to 2014. And I think this might be something fundamental, because without coming over, apologies here, but without coming over all Pat Kane on you, it's a bit like what he would say if he was here. It's a bit like an example of the network society. He would invoke Manuel Castells and probably lost in the sentence, But there's something going on about a generation of younger folk than myself and Jim being politicised and becoming politically literate and not necessarily being completely partisan in a way, party partisan. And I think this is amazing. And I think some of the things going on, the shortcomings and everything we all do, but some of this is pretty exciting. And whatever happens, September 2014, there's forces and views and imaginations being unleashed that can't be put back in the kind of tube of toothpaste, etc. But I think with that, and I think that you have to hold on to it, I think it's fantastic. There's also numerous limitations in Scottish mainstream public life, in the public sphere and in the media. Now again, it's very, very easy to, when Scots are getting just driven mad by the media, to rail against the media and just say it's their fault, it's a conspiracy. I mean, if you look at the Daily Telegraph, last week they were obsessed with Alex Salmond's trousers, or trews as they call them, because there'd be £250 of money, public money spent on his tartan trews, and they had about five items on it when you went on their website, and you thought, you couldn't make it up, you know, it's like a magic roundabout version of kind of the Independence Referendum. Daily Mail, similarly, the inadequacies of the BBC and STD, but these haven't come about mainly by conspiracy. I mean, obviously, the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail are focused, deliberate political projects, but most of this has come about because of the limited nature of Scottish democracy and society. And in the sense, in the public life that has been Scotland since the Union, it has been the same pre-Union, I'm not blaming it on 1707, Scotland historically has been dominated by institutional elites. So if you think of it, if you remember, the bit of Scottish history you got, you were talked about the holy trinity of education, law and the kirk, and those are the three bits of Scottish institutional life embedded and autonomous after the Union. And they were heavy kind of institutions. And so there's been a way in which we haven't become this full flowering democracy historically. We like to think of ourselves. So there's voices missing and pluralism missing in parts of Scottish society where they should be there. So this brings me to what I call the missing in Scotland argument, is that if you look at the last three Scottish Parliament elections, 1 million people missing in the last three compared to previous turnouts in Westminster elections. And this missing Scotland is younger, it's poorer, more lives in social housing. The place with the lowest turnout in all Scotland is Glasgow Province, with 34.5% in the last Scottish Parliament election. But this missing Scotland is everywhere. It's not like some Glasgow effect or West of Scotland effect or pathologising poor people. It is everywhere. And the place with the lowest turnout in the last year's local government elections was the two wards with the lowest turnout were both in Aberdeen. Old Harbour, which is actually part of the city centre, has a 20% turnout. So the missing Scotland is everywhere, and one of the challenges of that energy I was talking about is how it can bring back that missing Scotland, because that would be quite a fundamental and irreversible change. And so just got kind of two other sort of thoughts to kind of conclude with. One is underneath that binary nature of yes, no, and how it's been seen in the media and some of the political conversations, Anna Sarwar and Nicola Sturgeon shouting through each other on Scotland tonight. Part of the show that started with a 200,000 audience and ended with a 60,000 audience because people just switched off. Unless you're really, really partisan, people do not like to hear politicians just talking through each other. And as far as I'm concerned, Anna Sarwar was slightly worse than Nicola Sturgeon in that. That's not really the main point. This is just bad politics and bad media. But something is going on. That underneath this sense of yes, no, and kind of fixed, defined sovereignty and authority, something much more interesting is going on. And that's about, underneath yes, no, is a kind of modern, late modern sense of kind of what is sovereignty, what is political identity, what is authority, how these things are shared, and kind of cooperation at different levels in Scotland, the rest of the UK, Europe, etc. And that's a very, very modern set of considerations. So, for instance, phrases like the parliamentary sovereignty of the British Parliament, a phrase I balk at. But I also have a problem with, or worry about phrases like the sovereignty of the Scottish people, because sovereignty is this problematic thing now in this modern age. Yes, Scotland is on this journey about self-government, but at least phrases that invoke things like sovereignty or absolutes need to be questioned, because that's not really what the modern age is about. This debate is really about a different kind of independence. And I think the independence that is being offered by the SNP is a qualified kind, is a conditional kind, but what it is doing is this is normalising the idea of independence in Scotland. Until 2011, it wasn't thought of by most Scottish elites or the British government very, very serious. And that's something that is, again, I think, an irreversible change. The fact that the air is filled with talk of how you establish a North Sea oil fund, have we missed the boat on that? tried it, the currency, the nature of UK debts, and the nature of UK assets, which are of course huge. And the challenge, someone again broken out of a political bubble, the challenge of how we live on an island with that global centre of London, the fact that the Danny Dorling point, Professor Danny Dorling of Sheffield, that the UK is the fourth most unequal state in all the developed world, has become, not quite talked about in bars, etc., but has become broken out of a bubble, and on existing trends, the UK will become the most unequal state, passing the three others, with the coalition cuts, etc. And so I think that brings up the challenges of the conventional nature of kind of between yes and no on the surface, the kind of quest for a different Scotland, and how we ask debates about and question about poverty, inequality, how we develop our public services differently, and don't go down the English route, but at the same time don't just like blithely think that everything's perfect in education or health. And the point I'm just going to conclude on is that I thought it was interesting today that being floated in Scotland Sunday, Andrew Wilson of the SNP talking about how a possible independent Scottish constitution could evolve. And I think that while after any vote there has to be expert advice and so on and authority, the idea of an independent constitution, he thought being formed by a council of state, was it council of state? Was it council of state? Yeah. Council of Scotland? That's what formed the government, the Scottish government, and the living secretaries of state for Scotland, whom there are 10, 9 men, 1 woman. And I just thought that, in a way, this was political mood music to do, to get people thinking of what a vote's like after what the violence like after September 2014 if a yes vote happens. But really, in terms of the Constitution and how we do that, and what it says about us, we do not want to try and just leave that to a group of experts doing it, and a group of kind of ageing male experts. There's so many examples around the world where people have realised that doing a constitution says what you are as a people, and the process is as important as the content. So you're from Iceland and the crowdsourcing constitution to Australia, where they drew together 1,000 random people for a national convention. There's lots of ways of doing this and creating and challenging the stilted democracy that has been part of Scotland, challenging the civic Scotland bit as well, and doing it differently and saying this is what we want to be as a people, imagining it being active. And so we can just think about these things that are possible now and say we don't have to put up with just that narrow version of Scotland. We can, be something better. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerry. I think of these thanks before news never easy. And it's quite odd to look out and I can't see faces, I just see kind of something blurred out there. So, I hope you can see them better. What I wanted to do in my contribution is really to reflect on where we are and where I think we may go over the course of the next year, rather than say what we're saying in the book about the options on the other side of the referendum. I'm tempted to say buy the book if you want that, but I think there is an opportunity here at the moment over the next year to shape this book. One of my favourite authors on constitutional politics is a chap called Bruce Ackerman, who's an American constitutional lawyer, and he has written very eloquently about American constitutional development, and he suggests that America has had a series of what he calls constitutional moments. And he argues that constitutional moments are a superior form of politics, when people engage with the polity as a whole, consider their notions of who they are, how they relate to one another. And he argues that this is superior to what he calls normal, ordinary politics, everyday politics, which is all about factions and arguments. I suppose what we're witnessing in the United States at the moment is an extreme form of normal factional politics. It is interesting that Ackerman meant by a constitutional moment something that was seen as superior, he saw as superior, a higher form of politics. And I should stress by moment he was referring not to a kind of an hour, like a brief moment, but a period over a number of years. Reflecting on that, I asked myself, to what extent are we in our own Scottish constitutional moment? And if we are, to what extent can we argue that it is any different from ordinary politics? What's the relationship between the constitutional debate and the everyday public policy matters that concern us, the state for schools, the hospitals, the roads, and so on and so forth? What's the relationship between these? And really, you know, is this really superior? Is it better? And I have to admit, I've gone through a number of kind of changes in my view of this. That's what I want to really share with you just now. I want to consider Scotland's constitutional law. What does it mean? Who does it belong to? How do we define the parameters of this? What is involved in constitutional politics? And I want to pick up on a big theme in Gerry's presentation just now, and that is that I think constitutional politics historically, in this country particularly, and certainly in the United States, is defined far too narrowly. It is defined as simply about relations between different levels of government. It's defined all too often in terms of the relations between legislatures, executives, judiciaries. It might be defined in terms of certain types of rights, usually negative rights. But I think that's an old-fashioned, an old constitutionalism. Modern constitutionalism, new constitutionalism, I would suggest, and there's ample examples of this from across the world, is a much, much more open notion of constitutionalism. Indeed, it's so open that it's too open, some might suggest. I don't think so, but it's very open. And it is very inclusive. It's inclusive in terms of the people who engage in these debates, as well as in terms of the issues that are part of constitutional debate. We've had some fascinating examples of that in the last 30 years or so. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the creation of new states in Central Europe, which involved the drawing up of new constitutions, and beyond that in South America, constitutional revision. And what we've seen is a dramatic shift from a kind of an elitist, old constitutional, limited in terms of what we talk about, and limited in terms of the people who engage with this. It was the kind of middle class, white, male-dominated, elite-dominated kind of constitutionalism to a much, much more open thing. I always think about this when I say, middle-aged, middle-class, white male. I'm really talking to myself here. And it seems to me that one of the questions that I'm interested in is the extent to which our constitutional movement is really still one of that kind of movements, was old-fashioned old constitutionalism, or are we able to open it up and to make it? Now, if you'd asked me this question about a year or so ago, I would have been fairly pessimistic, and I was arguing about a year ago, as many still do, that this debate is dull, it's adversarial, it's just horrible, and I really didn't like the debate. In fact, I'll be honest, I'm not offending anyone here, I wasn't keen on a referendum on independence, and I remember actually being invited to some fellow academics into Duke House in Edinburgh by the then Constitution Minister, Mike Russell at that time, to discuss this, and my colleagues were all being very polite and saying, well, you can do it this way and that way. Now it's like, we just don't do it at all. I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake because I think that old constitutionalism has, or is in the process, I think, of being replaced. I think there is a debate taking place which is worth having, and I want to consider what I mean by that. It seems to me that if we look at those everyday public policy issues that I mentioned a moment ago, and how they relate to the Constitution, there seem to me to be broadly three categories of relationships. There are matters which are core to this constitutional debate, and we're all very familiar with these core issues. These are the issues that Sarah and Nicola Sturgeon were battling about. These are the things that are covered in the press and television. It's that adversarial stuff around currency, they get to join the EU, tribe defence will be exposed and all the rest of it. Those are the core. And it seems to me that one of the main problems in this debate is that for those of us who might be interested in any of these issues, it's quite difficult to get into the debate because it's not a subtle debate. It's a very angry debate, it's a very adversarial debate. And I think that's a challenge. I think it's a great challenge just to try and open our way into it, because there must be voices, there are voices out there that need to be heard. And I think one of the things we wanted to do with the book was to offer a platform to voices which would not necessarily take one side or the other in the referendum, but had something different to say and raise questions and issues for both sides. And I think we've managed to do that with a couple of contributions in the book. So that's one challenge in terms of the core issues. It strikes me that there's also another set of issues. And it's a problematic area, that's those issues which are kind of like isolated from the constitutional debate. Over the last few months, I've been doing this work which is kind of looking at the future of local governance, broadly defined in Scotland. Not just local government, how health boards will interact with local government and all the rest. It's very much following on from what I did as a member of the Christie Commission in the delivery of public services. And I'm going around speaking to people who are very much at the front line in delivering services and speaking to them about where they think we should be going. How could we better improve our public services? And in the process of having these discussions and interviews, it has been striking how many people have said to me that they watch television and see the news coverage of the referendum and such like, and how distant it feels from their daily reality. Ask me about delivering services, ask me about caring about the kind of issues that affect our daily lives. And that worries me that should be the case. Now, many of these people say to me that's happening, and they're delighted it's happening because they're isolated from it all, and they're kind of protected from it all. They want that to be the case. They don't want the kind of core kind of arguments, the kind of angry, adversarial stuff to spill over into this. And that ought to cause us some degree of concern. I think we need to try and ensure that those two sets of debates are linked and in a positive way. And there's a third set. I think it's this third set that I find both most interesting and a little inspiring. I think there's a set of issues, everyday issues, that are being kind of insinuated rather into the debate. Matters which affect people's everyday lives, which a number of political actors, organisations and such like are saying these are important. There's this constitutional debate. Let's ensure that we are heard. Not necessarily taking sides. I want to give you a couple of examples that I've observed at close hand. I'd like to claim to have been involved in that. There would be an exaggeration. Two particularly that come to mind. One is something that I observed at close hand was some work that was done by the Scottish Refugee Council last year and beginning of this year. This is an organisation I had heard often and much about, that a former student of mine was working for. I was invited to participate in a working group. In fact, what happened was I went along and learned an enormous amount. I probably contributed very little. It was fascinating to watch this group of people, experts in this broad area of public policy, refugee and asylum, which clearly touches on just every aspect of public policy, discussing and debating what is a good policy, or set of policies in this area. How would the Constitution relate to that? What would the different constitutional scenarios have to offer them? And essentially presenting a report, as they did, which challenged both sides. I think it was a wonderful example of the insinuation of a fundamentally important set of matters into the debate. It was done tremendously well. Coverage at the time, and it was not just I think it deserved, and I'm raising this now because I think it deserves a lot of coverage, and I'd like to go away to the website and read the report, because I think it is a great example. It seems to me that that's an example of much that's going on across Scotland. And that is part of the constitutional debate. There's a widening out of this debate, which is really, really welcome. The other debate which I've been watching at close hand is something that many of you may be aware of, and that's a campaign that's been launched by the three island councils in Scotland, Western Isles, Shetland and Orkney. They've come together and they've got this campaign, Our Islands, Our Future. And what they're basically saying to the two sides in the constitutional debate is, here's what we want, here's what we need for our islands, what are you going to do about it? I was up in Lerwick just the other week, a conference which they'd organised, and it was an absolutely fantastic event. It was quite inspiring actually, as you heard people talking about their island communities and what they needed, and listening to the campaign groups, because both together in Scotland were represented and spoke and said, here's what we think should happen, with a government minister up from London, a government minister up from Edinburgh, talking around these issues. And to a large extent, it's conducted in, I think, a constructive and positive way. It was the odd kind of highly partisan and not so nice comment, but for the most part, it was conducted really well. What I'm getting at here is that I think that the real challenge over the next year is to insinuate more of those kinds of issues into the debate in a way that allows this not to be the debate and controlled by either the media, who will always go for adversarial type approaches, a black and white Scotland, but also not the politicians necessarily at the heads of these campaigns. It strikes me that if we are able to achieve the kind of superior constitutional moment that Bruce Ackerman talked about, then it will be up to what happens in our communities. I said earlier that I was of the view that we shouldn't have a referendum. A couple of years ago, when I was arguing this with ministers at the time, pointlessly of course. I now think, well, actually, as I'm watching this debate, and as I hope to see it evolve over the next year, I hope to see evidence of a kind of new constitutionalism, an opening up with more people participating, more issues being raised. Because a constitution is simply a dry document, it's not worth having. A constitution is about how we constitute ourselves, how we see ourselves, and how we relate to others. And I think that's a great challenge, a challenge to all of us. Thanks very much.
just want to say about the Refugee Council, James, because I was involved in that as well. I agree with you, but I actually also think you really underestimated your own contribution, because I think what you brought to that discussion about refugees following, in the Independence was thinking about refugees, people that are something else, and the principles that you knew about the Christian Commission. And I think, and that was great, but I think what it leaves us in the year coming is things like the Going Home pilot and the posters that are on the chairs in Brown Street recently, which you may know about, brought us very much to the reality, which is the gap between that thinking and the reality. So I don't want to move slower and slower than I suspect I am, but that I think is really the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's quite enough to say it's all going to be nice for independence.
No, I agree with all of that. I didn't realise you were there. That was one of the real experts on market here, actually. I think I wouldn't want to suggest it's going to be easy, and I don't think it. The issues that will have to be addressed by Scotland on the other side of the referendum, regardless of the result, are going to be tricky issues. One thing I think will have to be faced, regardless of the outcome, will be some of the problems we've got with public finances. It strikes me that there's no vote, there is no doubt that the Parliament will either be amended or done with or whatever. I mean, it's not going to last. If we don't, we have some financial challenges. Well, yes, we've got some major financial challenges. And I think we've got to start growing up in Scotland in some respects. Let me be less positive. I think one of the problems in Scotland, one of the ways I would distinguish Scottish politics in the 20th century is that we became expert in asking for more from London. We were very, very good at it. We could always point to reasons for having more resources, more money in Scotland. We could point to the Glasgow problem, we could point to the health problem. What we've been absolutely poor at doing in Scotland, and this is not really just a constitutional point, it's certainly not in the narrow sense, but it is in its broadest sense, is taking some degree of responsibility. But we need to shift our resource, we need to shift our thinking from picking up the pieces. There's a former health minister said to me recently, we're great at picking bodies up that have fallen off the cliff, we're very poor at stopping falling off in the first place. We're very poor at prevention, very poor at prevention. And I think that is where we need to start thinking, and we've got to shift that. That is not going to be done easily. I like to think that in the next year that we have an opportunity to raise some of these issues. Things I would like to see happen are not going to happen in the short term, probably never in the long term. But what I would say is I think we need to push ahead with these. So I'm sure that you guys are going to have
just before it came out, it was 1 o'clock. I heard in the news that the shadow education minister had now welcomed free schools, and indeed he mentioned entrepreneurs taking over schools. Now, Gerry has mentioned in previous articles that the divergence, even without independence, in public policy, if you like, what is presumably it would diverge even more after independence, and what are the safety, what safety can we give to maintaining the system and not going down in public policy, especially in education, other areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole debate about in academic and non-academic circles about how different Scotland is, and there's been a line pushed by some people in Scotland isn't that different because they look at some interpretations of Scottish social action surveys. This is particularly associated with John Curtis and others, and it's such a small view and one partial measurement of Scotland. Scotland is different and not different at the same time. Indeed, there's even a philosophical problem with talking about difference because it's measuring ourselves with the UK state as being this great example, when it's clearly not. We're different in so many ways. We're a nation, we don't vote Tory in very large numbers, and also when you get into other stuff on public services, there's huge divergences between Scotland and England, rest of the UK, about private sector involvement in the public sector. So we have absolutely hard data on that we are different. But I think one of the things that we need to explore in this is, so yes, no to market vandals and market vandalisation of the public sector, but free schools, academies, foundation hospitals, tap into something about public policy innovation and how you think about the future of public services. This is not an argument for them. What I'm saying is that you have to try and think about opposing that, but understanding some of the rationale that's in it that isn't just about some grotesque right-wing view of the world. And so how we think about public sector innovation, particularly in hard times. So, for instance, as a person growing up politically, I was a member of the Labour Party for many years, and certainly until recently, I can't speak maybe in the last couple of years, but until recently, prominent Labour Party members would openly tell you how they would talk differently in public and private about education. So in public they would have an agenda that was very sympathetic, wouldn't offend EIS, but in private they would talk about how do you get rid of bad teachers, how do you engage in aspiration, ambition, low-performing schools, etc., and kids, and how do you motivate people, and how do you get out of kind of just education being a closed circuit, a closed set of conversations, as systems often become. But that was entirely different between public and private. So we have to do the thing of opposing the market vandalism as vandalism, but not ending up just thinking everything's all right in Scotland. Now that's partly going to be aided by the tough choices, but it's a debate. I mean, just to pose it as a controversial point, part of the independence debate, I'm not saying all of it, is partly a yearning for the world not changing. For us thinking, there are people who say things like, can we go back to the Scotland of 1945 to 75? Well, apart from the fact that's a past world, it was rather gendered, hierarchical, the council was all pervading authority, there's people walking around tutting at each other, it had its pluses, and it had its minuses. And so part of our debate, there's a radical side to the independence debate, and there's a kind of like a search for sureness when the world's going to be less sure.
Can I believe it? I mean, it's not to dispute or challenge what you just said, but I sometimes think that one of the problems we've got ourselves into in Scotland is that we focus on this whole difference and divergence debate. And I'm particularly fed up reading academic articles by colleagues of mine who are obsessed with divergence and are we diverging from this speaking? Personally, I just don't care about that. There is a divergence I'm interested in, and that's diverging from Scotland's bad public policy in the past instead of setting things out. I think we need to lift our eyes beyond our immediate neighbour and look across at other places, but not to do it critically, not to do it and say, we want to be like Scandinavia. What does that mean? I mean, Scandinavia isn't one polity, it's a range of polities in which there is a vast variety of options, including in delivering public services through market, but done in a regulated way, done in a good way, with outcomes being at the forefront of all. How do we achieve a better Scotland? We've got terrible record in terms of public health. The question is how do we diverge from that? And I think, I think we should just pinch, steal, borrow, whatever, wherever is appropriate. That may mean occasionally looking down south and following England. It may mean that we have to converge with policy. Something maybe that's been sacredly distinctive about Scotland. If it's not working for us, abandon it. If it means adopting a policy that's working south of the border, so be it. I would argue that some of the experiments in local democracy taking place in things like Birmingham and elsewhere are exciting that we should be following. So there are occasions when I think we do want to follow south, only when, and I think this is where we would totally agree, it is changing the outcomes for the people.
I was at the Radical Independence Week a couple of weeks back in the cafe, and what struck me was the huge amount of enthusiasm and optimism amongst mainly young people in the Yes campaign. And a lot of us here are old enough to remember the depression that hit us for a couple of decades after the first referendum knockback. And then, we went up to George Square and we went through all the Scotland First rallies when the Tories kept on getting in, and a lot of us have spent most of our adult life feeling as though we were in chains. So I just wonder, if it's a no vote next year, what do we do with all this optimism and desire for a more just Scotland if it's a no vote?
Well, you see, James and I've got a cheeky little slight hand on that. When we were working on this book, we had a working title, Rise Now and Be a Nation, ? Because you always have working titles for things, and sometimes sadly those working titles become the defining or become the reality because you can't think of anything else. And we realised in that title, you know, it was once a book called The Soviet Union, A New Civilization, question mark, and I actually took the question mark off the second edition of the web. And we just thought, obviously, there's no, you can't get like nuance into that title. So I was certainly inspired by it. There's loads of books called After Something. There's a book called After Britain by Tom Nairn. So that title was pinched. And by after independence, we meant after an independence vote, or I think what's even more profound, because I don't think this will not happen, this debate is changing Scotland. This debate up until September 2014, even if there's a no vote, for a start, independence is becoming normalised. The fact is there's wide sets of discussions about, you know, the role of the Treasury in independent Scotland or not, the role of the Bank of England, how you have fiscal unions, currency unions, etc. Quite technical debates that are, even though, you know, you could say they're sometimes not that nuanced in the way some people are talking about it, this is quite significant. And the UK government, I think, in a way, they operate contradictorily on this. Until May 2011, they thought Scottish nationalism and independence was like, you know, a bad version of Restless Natives or something, you know, if you remember that film. I actually spoke to somebody last night who said they were an extra in that film. Now they kind of half think it's serious and half don't, because they read the polls, they're obsessed with their own stuff about, you know, the parliamentary sovereignty of the British Parliament. And they're also obsessed with the European question. The referendum Westminster talks about the European referendum. So as is often the case, they're pointing two ways at the same time. But I think that normalising of these discussions, as long as, you know, if the independence vote's won, it's obviously we're into the beginning of a new state. But if it's lost, and it's lost with a high yes vote, this changes everything, because it makes the British state realise, you know, Scotland's one-third landmass of the United Kingdom. You know, to my mind, it's a 40% rule. If the yes vote gets above 40%, it's a significant moment in the history of the British state. And what you were talking about in terms of groups like the Radical Independence Conference, I don't know if everyone knows, but the Radical Independence Conference were a breakaway from the Socialist Workers' Party of 20-somethings in that. And with all the limits of coming from the SWP, which is kind of like, sorry anyone in the SWP, ultra-leftist and a bit vanguardist, as it coming from that model. This has displayed a kind of real interesting explosion of energy that is just fascinating, and it's filled with contradictions and you know, people talking about being a vanguard, and then other people saying, what on earth does this secret language mean? So I think that's kind of genuine, people talking like that. And there's other groups that say like National Collective, Jimmy Reid Foundation, and there's just something that is about a new generation of Scotland stepping forward, having voice, feeling this gives them possibility. And in fact, someone said this to me the other day in one of the sort of conversation you wouldn't have if it wasn't this vote. They said, what is happening is that, I thought it was a remarkably interesting insight I wouldn't have got to myself, is they said, a lot of us have grown up in Scotland thinking we needed to have permission to do things. You know, I mean, the chap that set the big issue in Scotland said to me years ago, people used to say to him, who gave you permission? And he said, no one, we just did it because we knew there was a gap. People are feeling they have the permission to do things. People are seeing that they have authority and power. And that, I think, is remarkable. Okay, you know, these groups are all under-resourced and, you know, they're running on goodwill and activism, that how some of them continue after a vote, if it were a no vote, is significant. But I think there's something happening about a different Scotland. None of this is all perfect from any of us, but people are talking about whether being a bit more Nordic or the Commonweal challenging kind of like, you know, the stale, narrow version of politics. It's kind of significant.
I'm just about to send off the manuscript for another book. This referendum is really good for business. So the Scottish question, what it's intended to do is to look back over the last 100 years or so, and look at what it is, the Scottish question. And in the process of doing that, I came across an article I remember reading just after the 79 referendum. It was in the autumn of 1979 in The Scotsman by Neil Asherson. It was his final parting piece. As you may remember, Asherson had been in Scotland for, I think, 5-6 years as a correspondent, and trying to cover that truly exciting period in the lead up to 79. He'd had enough. The referendum had gone the wrong way from his point of view. It's a fascinating and a brilliant piece of writing, and in it he says, what next? And in a sense it's kind of reflecting on the question you asked. And he argued then that people are depressed, people are thinking it's all over, and oh dear, it's all hell. And he said, yeah, it'll be like that for a while, and I'm getting the hell out of here, so I'm with you now. But he maintained, and he gave his reasons, that these issues will not die. And he said the pressures that brought the then devolution referendum to fruition, to have a referendum back then, have not fallen away. And the issues, I think, that have risen in relation to this debate have not gone away. And especially, I would argue, the broader sense of what the Constitution is, the things I was talking about earlier. So in a way, I'm actually now coming to think, in the conclusion of this book, here you go, give a preview of the conclusion of this other book, I'm arguing that the referendum itself would describe as historic. It's got great quotes from Toby Devine and everybody else. This is an historic occasion. It may be, it may not be, is my conclusion. We don't know yet, and we won't know for a long time, regardless of the outcome of the referendum. I think it could be a very important event, but it will only be one event. And I think what we're seeing are bigger trends taking place, pushing open our politics. And I think this referendum, actually the debate that's going on, is part of that. And what I hope I'm seeing, and maybe it is a rosy view, but make my rosy view true for me, is that there's a wider public pushing open, and some of these groups. It's fascinating to both sides tell me, and I've no reason to disbelieve them, that they are seeing people engaging in politics who've never been engaged in politics before. What we want to see is that continuity. And this is, I think, an important opportunity to open up our politics in a way we've not had for a very long time. So regardless of the outcome of the referendum, it is a yes, no, I would like to think that that will